I want to welcome you on behalf of the BB&T Center for the Study of Capitalism of the Schools of Business of Wake Forest. The Wake Forest Department of Economics are the sponsors for the lecture, and we have support from the Hayek Fund for Academic Innovation at the Institute for Humane Studies. Our speaker today is Professor Bruce Caldwell. Bruce is research professor at Duke University and director of the Center for the History of Political Economy at Duke. He's past president of the Southern Economic Association, and just a couple of weeks ago gave his presidential address in New Orleans. And in the year 1999 to 2000, he was president of the History of Economics Society. Professor Caldwell is general editor of the F.A. Hayek Papers, and he's also the author of an intellectual biography of Hayek. The title is Hayek's Challenge, an intellectual biography of F.A. Hayek, published by the University of Chicago Press in 2004. Bruce's topic for us today is F.A. Hayek's The Road to Serfdom, Its Origin and Reception. Please join me in welcoming our frequent visitor, Bruce Caldwell, back to Wake Forest.
Well, thank you very much, Dan. I do want to talk about Hayek's Road to Serfdom today. It was published in 1944, and it actually is one of the University of Chicago Press's best-selling books. It was frequently reprinted. There was an American paperback edition in 1956. There was a 1976 one to kind of 1776 to 1976 memorial edition. There was one in the 90s that Milton Friedman wrote an introduction for. And then I, as editor of the Collected Works, brought out the Collected Works edition in 2007. And interestingly, Hayek died in 1992, so Road to Serfdom was published in 1944. This is an old book by somebody who's dead. You know, he's an economist. Typically, these are not the sort of people whose books are going to be read by great masses of people. But all of that started to change in the last 6 or 7 years. Part of it was that the downturn that started to take place in 2007, that has had repercussions even until today, brought about a debate about what should the government do about this, if anything. To what extent did the government help cause it? To what extent can the government help prevent those in the future? And this became kind of crystallized in the debate between government intervention versus free markets. I wonder if there's people who can represent these views: John Maynard Keynes, Friedrich Hayek. So one part of the new interest in Keynes and Hayek has been simply the fact that we're in a recession that is reminiscent of the Great Depression in some ways, in terms of its, certainly in terms of its duration. It's been one of the longer ones of the 20th century relative to other downturns. But also the fact that in 1931, Keynes and Hayek had a great debate. So this was something that got people's attention. And I don't know, who here has seen the Keynes-Hayek rap videos? Okay. If you have not seen the Keynes-Hayek rap videos, I recommend them. You'll have to go to YouTube, okay? We can give you instructions afterwards if you don't know how to get to YouTube. I'm assuming this audience probably knows how. And just do Keynes-Hayek. Keynes spelled K-E-Y-N-E-S. And there's two of them, and both of them feature a guy named Mike Munger, who was a libertarian candidate for governor in North Carolina in 2008. He has a cameo role in both. If you can see if you can identify him. His role is more prominent one than the other. I won't go any further than that. So one interest in Hayek then was this debate about the role of government in periods of downturn, periods of a business cycle, recession. But the other way that Hayek became known has actually to do with the road to serfdom. And it was during the early debates about Obamacare. And some people who were angry about Obamacare said this is just socialized medicine. And people said, well, who would be a good opponent of socialism? And Hayek was known as an opponent of socialism. The Road to Serfdom is a brief against socialism. It has lots of other things going on in it, but certainly it's known for that. And what took place, and it was one of these bizarre instances, wholly bizarre, actually. I'll just tell you it from my point of view. I'm teaching a summer school class, and one of my students comes in and says, "The Road to Serfdom is #1 on Amazon.com." Okay, and I understand that someone in this audience tried to order some books of The Road to Serfdom and were cut off, and it was because, you know, when it's #1 on Amazon.com and it's The Road to Serfdom, they don't have that many copies sitting in the, so they limited the number that people could get. It stayed #1 for 10 days, was in the top 100 for over 2 months. I don't know where it is now. Someone will probably tell me at the end of this talk because it's easy to check. But it was on the basis of Glenn Beck having a half-hour program, holding up The Road to Serfdom and saying, this book is an assault on socialism. This is the sort of book that we need to read and understand the arguments in if we're going to be able to oppose these particular programs that we dislike. And he actually had a memorable line. I never tire of telling this one. Some of you have heard it. But he said this was like a Mike Tyson right-hand jab to the jaw of socialism, which I thought, as a metaphor, is a fairly bizarre one. As I said, it was bizarre from beginning to end. But you know, that's what got people to buy the book. Don't know if they read it, but lots of people bought it, which was wonderful for me, as it turns out. Anyway, so what I'm going to do today is let's back up and let's go back to the 1930s and 1940s. And I'm going to tell you the story about how Hayek came to actually write this book, and some of the initial reception to it, and then how it became kind of an iconic book of its day. Just as it came to represent certain arguments that were taking place today, it played a similar role right at the end of World War II. And a small magazine called the Reader's Digest. Does anyone know what the Reader's Digest is? This is a younger audience. So the Reader's Digest, so my memory of the Reader's Digest is when I would go to my aunt's house in New Jersey and go into the bathroom, there'd always be Reader's Digest sitting there. Because what Reader's Digest is a small paperback monthly magazine with very short articles in it. Okay? So it's a great thing to have there if you wanted to have a quick read. Okay? Reader's Digest. And it would have articles of various sorts, many inspirational ones. You know, my favorite character would always be the person's father or mother. And then they would have condensations of books. So if you didn't want to read a 500-page book, you'd get the Reader's Digest version, and it would be down to 20 pages. And that's going to play a role in why The Road to Serfdom is something that we still remember today. Okay, with that set up, I'm going to talk for maybe a half an hour, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions or you know, we can go anywhere. It doesn't have to be about The Road to Serfdom. We can talk about anything you want to talk about that has something to do with Hayek, peripherally at least, but there we go. Okay, so who was Hayek? He was an economist who was born in Austria. He went to the London School of Economics in 1931. 1931 is when he gave some lectures. He stayed at the London School of Economics till 1950. Went to the United States for 12 years, was at the University of Chicago. For those who know the name Milton Friedman, they were close friends. And then spent some time in Germany and Austria. Won the Nobel Prize in 1974. He was an economist who actually had, as I was telling a class this morning, he had contact with many of the most important economists of the 20th century in various ways. He managed to be the right place in the right time. So he was an interesting historical figure just in those terms. So to tell the story of The Road to Serfdom, we'll have to look at the period when he goes to the London School of Economics. His immediate arrival at London School of Economics, he has this debate with John Maynard Keynes that I alluded to earlier. But within a very short period of time, he starts to think that there's a bigger problem than talking about business cycles, and that is to deal with the question of socialism. Okay? So if you think about the 1930s, you know, World War I was over. You have the Roaring '20s in this country, but certain parts of the country are not doing that well, but most parts are. England was kind of moribund during the 1920s in terms of its economy, but the Great Depression takes place. It's The slump of 1930 suddenly becomes very deep, and you've got this really bad period of time, and a lot of people were saying, well, maybe capitalism isn't the way, or free market economy is not the way to organize an economy. I wonder what the alternatives might be. Okay, and well, there were alternatives on offer right at that point in time because the Soviet Union had emerged at the end of World War I. You had fascisms of various sorts arising in places like Spain and Italy and later Germany. Okay? Well, if you're a thinking person, you're saying, well, the free market system seems to have collapsed. I don't really like totalitarian systems like communism or fascism. They seem to be really restrictive and punitive towards large groups of people. I wonder what the middle way might be. And for most of the intelligentsia, most people who have a mind at all, socialism seemed to be the right way. It would correct the problems that you have with a free market system that had collapsed, but it doesn't go all the way to the restriction of individual liberties that you get under these various sorts of other systems. So there was a general presumption for socialism as the way forward. It wasn't always called socialism. In the popular press, it was also often called planning. If you wanted to think of a phrase that has the same resonance today, it would be regulation. Okay? We've had all these problems with the financial system. What we need is more regulation. No one's ever saying, what regulation? They're just saying regulation. Regulation, good. Okay? This will be a way of stopping the problems that we've got. Well, the same sort of idea was in the popular mind at the time, planning. We don't really know what we're going to mean by that. We're not saying what we mean by it, but plan. If we can just plan this out so that we don't have the anarchy of the marketplace. A wonderful phrase from Marx that seemed to capture the sort of problems that were taking place. We had some sort of rational planning, we would be able to avoid these sorts of problems. So this was a general presumption. In addition, Hayek was teaching at the London School of Economics. The London School of Economics was formed in 1895 by Fabian socialists, by a brand of socialism that was existing in Britain. And they hired Hayek. They were wonderfully open-minded in terms of the diversity of voices that they had at the London School of Economics in terms of professors, because Hayek is not obviously a socialist. But many of his colleagues were. And so part of what he was responding to were debates that he would have simply with his colleagues in the senior common room at the London School of Economics. I actually have a little factoid. Just imagine being a student at the London School of Economics. If you were there in the 1936-37 summer term, on Thursdays you could take Hayek's Problems of a Collectivist Economy from 5 to 6 p.m. and then go over same day to the next classroom and take Evan Durbin's Economic Planning and Theory and Practice. Okay? So you could get actually the architect of the critique of planning and the architect of planning. Just take their classes back to back on the same day. What a wonderful environment. So he's having debates with his colleagues. He's responding to what's going on in the popular press. But there was one other thing, and this is directly relevant for his actually coming to write The Road to Serfdom. It was the British intelligentsia's understanding of what fascism was. Okay? So fascism is something that's arising, as I said, in Italy, Spain, and in Germany. And the typical response to it was, well, fascism is basically the last dying gasp of the capitalist system. It's a reaction to the coming of socialism. So in Karl Marx's vision of what would happen to capitalism through time, there would be crises of increasing duration and intensity. At some point, at the pit of one of these very bad downturns, class consciousness would arise. There would be a dictatorship of the proletariat, and there would be a gradual movement to full communism through time. So the capitalists, seeing the downturn of capitalism, this great depression that presumably the next step would be a movement to socialism, reacted against it. And this was a plausible argument. First of all, we were in the Great Depression. Okay? The downturn had taken place. Secondly, in Germany at least, some of the German cartels were supporting Hitler. Why would they support Hitler? Well, Hitler was opposed to communism. If the communists took over, those cartels weren't going to be doing so well. Hitler was famously antagonistic towards communism, so why not support him? That was some of the arguments that were being made. And also, in terms of when Hitler finally got kind of dictatorial powers in the spring of 1933, the first people he went after were the communists and the socialists. So it was clear the fascists were antagonistic towards the communists and the socialists. So the argument was that fascism is just another form of capitalism. It's what people do when they see that socialism is coming, what the capitalists do. Now, it was this argument, and in particular, this argument that had been expressed by the director of the London School of Economics, William Beveridge, that provoked Hayek to write a memo, a 6-page memo. I'm an historian of economic thought, and my mission here today is to tell you about Hayek, but it's also to get all of you to become historians of economic thought someday. So what I'm going to do is try to seduce you by giving you things, okay? So I have 3 copies of this. This is the first page of that memo that I mentioned. You know what, I really should be doing PowerPoints for this, but I kind of like having the human touch, okay? So I'm just going to bring them out. Just go ahead and have a look at this. What's that say? What's the first line up there? Yeah, right there. The title, the handwritten title. Ah, you're looking at the type part. Never mind. The handwritten part says Nazi socialism. Nazi socialism. So go ahead and pass that around. Pass that around. I want these things back. Okay, keep it. Go ahead, pass it back. Pass it back. So this is the first page of the memo. And the reason I'm passing it out and trying to get you to become historians of thought, do you want to have a look? Yeah, you can pass it back as you do. Well, Hayek always said the road to serfdom started out as this memo to William Beveridge that I wrote in 1938. Those of you who have that thing in your hand, what does the date at the top say? March 1933. Yeah? Does it say it? Yes. No one's yelling out. Okay. I'm the only one talking. So, it says March 1933. I thought this memo was forever lost. I'm the editor of the Road to Serfdom book. It would be great if I could get that memo. Well, in fact, that memo is in the collected works edition of the book in the appendix. That's the memo. And I always thought, because I'd read interviews that Hayek gave, where he said, yes, the Road to Serfdom started out as a memo that I wrote in 1938 for Lord Beveridge, and that's what got me started. And I saw this March 1933 bit, and I said, well, since he said 38, it can't be this. Anyway, I was at a conference. I was talking about the Road to Serfdom's about to come out. Within the next couple of years and get ready to send the stuff off to the publisher. Boy, I really wish I had the Beveridge memo. And it turns out that there was another historian of economic thought there who said, I've seen that memo. And I said, what? He said, yes, I was working in the Beveridge papers. And that memo exists in the Beveridge papers. And I said, well, this sounds great, but I mean, how, what are we going to do? I don't want to go down to, I was at a meeting in Cambridge, England. I don't want to have to go down to the LSE to get this. I'm getting ready to fly back out. She says, I've got it at my house. She had a Xerox machine. She took me to her house, found the memo, and gave it to me. And when I looked at it, I said, I know this piece of, I know this document. I've seen this document before. And it was then, only then, that I realized that I had it in my possession the whole time. It's just that because Hayek had misremembered and said, I gave this memo in 1938 to Beveridge, that I didn't realize that this was the memo. Anyway, this is all to get you excited about doing history of thought. Because just imagine how excited you would be if you thought something that was lost forever is suddenly sitting there right under your nose. You had it all the time. Anyway, that's my story about being an historian of economics. So this memo, what does he say in the memo? Well, he disagrees with that view. He says that, no, wait a second, fascism is not a form of capitalism. What does Nazi mean? National Socialism is what Nazi is shortened for, okay? He's saying that actually fascism is a form of socialism, okay? Not quite a form of socialism, but the arguments that he made was, first of all, if you take a look at the people who are currently Nazis in Germany, many of them started out as socialists. Secondly, in terms of their interventions in the economy, both Nazis and socialists want to intervene directly in the economy to try to control it. And thirdly, their attitude towards free markets and liberalism are to be opponents of it. Both of them agree that that is something that they want to get rid of. Democracy, free markets are things that they don't accept. So his argument then was, in fact, communism, socialism, and fascism have more in common with each other than either one of them does with a classical liberal vision that he had about a free market system. This was his argument to Beveridge in his memo. It's probably not a terribly controversial argument today, or at least it's one that people could, I think, defend very easily today. At the time, it would be a very reactionary sort of argument. It would be viewed as an argument of reactionary because people would say, look, if I think that socialism is the middle way and you're telling me that I have something in common with fascism, that doesn't make me feel like that's a very good argument. You're basically saying I agree with the fascists. So anyway, he didn't make this argument in general. It was just a memo to Lord Beveridge. He did give a talk in 1933 when he accepted the position at the LSE, gave an inaugural lecture in which he was criticizing socialism. Just in one paragraph of this long lecture. That was sufficient to get a student to come into his office the next day and say, look, I just want you to know that you've discredited yourself by being critical of socialism. We didn't know what your views were until you gave this lecture, but obviously, many of the students lost respect for you for taking that particular view. So I'm telling you this to kind of give you a sense of the time. Sense of the time was that socialism was something that was taken quite seriously as the middle way, and anyone who would oppose it would be viewed as quite strange, if not reactionary. Okay, Hayek didn't write the book right away. His decision, probably sometime around 1936 or 37, World War II starts in 1939. He's can see that the world is heading towards this, and his decision is he's an intellectual. He likes to write books. He wants to write a 2-volume work that talks about what he called, well, the title of it would be The Abuse and Decline of Reason. Okay? Imagine yourself getting ready to go into World War II, into a very extreme time. What's causing this? What sorts of ideas could allow the world to get to this particular point in time? And I have another handout that I will pass out. I said it was going to be a big book. It was going to be a 2-volume work. So this is his outline. And it will appear strange to you, so I'm going to take this one back a little further, and you can pass it up. It's going to be a book where he says, look, here we go. Try not to trip. My argument for how we got to this particular point in time is that there's a body of ideas that started in the 1800s, and his argument was it spread from France to Germany to England to the United States. And this set of ideas, this complex of ideas, took very different forms in France and Germany, in the United States and Britain, but they shared certain common characteristics. One of them was that we can use science to shape society, and the other is that democracy and socialism moved hand in hand through the 19th century and would emerge in the 20th century in full blossom. He said that this set of ideas, and what was the basis for his arguments, We don't have to go into the details of it. He certainly had experience by looking at the Fabian socialists he encountered in Britain. He went to the United States and encountered a progressive American economist named Wesley Clair Mitchell, who, even though his ideas are really different from socialism, shared the basic underlying assumptions that you can shape society and you can use the tools of science to do so to make it better. And the German historical school was something that he had encountered in his early days in training that also had similar views. So he thought, well, this is really different. German historical school, they were imperialists, German imperialists, conservative imperialists. You had Fabian socialists. You had progressive American reformers. But all of them had the same vision for how society would move forward through the ability of science to accompany progressive thought to shape society. This is what he thought was the abuse and decline of reason. This was setting up this set of ideas, very attractive ideas. One reason why socialism was so attractive in the 30s in Britain, kind of fits in with that. But he said these ideas can be dangerous if they're in hands of the sorts that they saw emerging in the 20th century with fascism and communism. So regardless of his larger project and how much we might believe it, it was in the process of developing that and saying, what are the consequences? Well, this is going to end up in a society that he would describe as the road to serfdom. Now, instead of doing the big book, he ends up just doing the road to serfdom. Why did he make that decision? What caused him to say, well, instead of doing the big book, I'm going to do this little book that, in fact, even though the Reader's Digest condensation is even shorter, the little book is something that was quite accessible to regular people. So we understand what happened by looking at some of his correspondence in February 1942. So when he first plans this book, he's not sure whether Western civilization is even going to survive. One reason he wants to do this is if the Axis powers win, he wanted to have a testimony as to why the world had suddenly collapsed on itself, the Western world. By 1942 or so, he starts to be more confident that the Allies are going to win the war. And in a letter to one of his friends, Jacob Weiner, in the United States, he says, although I'm fairly optimistic about the war, I am not by no means so about the peace, or rather about the economic regime that will follow the war. So what's he talking about here? Well, in a wartime economy, you basically, and this happened in World War I as well, you end up moving from a free market economy to a planned economy. You have production being planned by the center. You've got all these automobile factories. Government comes in and says, no more automobiles going to be made. We're going to transform these into factories that will produce tanks, that will produce armored vehicles of various sorts, airplanes, etc. So you've got planning from the center that takes over the whole economy. And there was enthusiasm among those who identified themselves as socialists, particularly in Britain, which is where he was writing, that maybe we should continue with this sort of setup once we get through the war. Let me give you a little bit of evidence. One bit comes from what Hayek called the men of science. These are science journals that everybody who was an intellectual would read. Nature magazine was the one that was the famous one that he was responding to. On the editorial pages of this Nature magazine, there was constant reminders that, well, okay, we've gotten into this problem we're engaged in World War II. We're having to do planning as a result of this. We should continue this planning and build a better society after the war. I've got a whole list of quotes. I'm just going to choose one. The contribution of science to the war effort should be a major one. Moreover, the work must not cease with the end of the war. The immediate concern of science in formulating policy and in other ways exerting a direct and sufficient influence on the cause of government is one to which we must hold fast. Science must seize the opportunity to show that it can lead mankind onward to a better form of society. So what form of society would that be? The Labour Party certainly had a very explicit set of directions. I'm going to read now from a speech, excuse me, in defense of a resolution proposed by Harold Lasky and passed at the Labor Party conference in May of 1942. So this is in the middle of the war. Labor would be elected as the party in the post-war era, but this is the argument in defense of a resolution that was proposed and passed by the Labor Party. Nationalization. So what is socialism? Socialism means basically public ownership of the means of production. You don't have private firms, you have the state basically owning the means of production. That's the general definition. We can have lots of debates about various forms of socialism, but that would be what he's responding to. And that's what Lasky was proposing that take place. Nationalization of the essential instruments of production before the war ends, which had happened. Maintenance of control of production and distribution after the war. This is the spearhead of this resolution. You must plan full production if you want full production. You must organize public welfare if you want to achieve public welfare. We have to direct and control the banks. We have to direct and control the landowner and the farmer. We have to take over shipping, railways, basic road transport, civil aviation. And he goes on and identifies the various areas that nationalization would take place. Finally, there was the Beveridge Plan. Lord Beveridge, the same person that he wrote the memo to, ends up, with the help of others, drafting a plan that is published in 1942 that outlines the British welfare state. And this was basically the blueprint for the British welfare state that emerged at the end of World War II. He had a further book in 1944, Employment, let me get the exact title, but it's basically a full employment addition to the basic bits of the welfare state. Can't find it. But the idea was you've got popular enthusiasm for planning. You've got political parties that are endorsing planning of a specific type. And you've got something like the Beveridge Report, which is actually laying out the blueprint for how it would take place. Now, there are contradictions between the full planning that was supported by Lasky and Beveridge, but this was the general direction in which Hayek was trying to push against. Now, one reason I'm going into details on this, it may seem a little bit tedious, but often people say, well, look, the road to serfdom is just saying if you have a little bit of planning, you're going to suddenly end up in a totalitarian state. That was not the situation that Hayek was trying to respond to in 1944 when this book was published. His idea was there are articulate and intelligent voices arguing for a much more extensive degree of planning than he thought would be compatible with individual liberty, freedom of choice, and the use of knowledge by individuals. So that was what he was arguing against in the book. Now, I'm not going to go through here the arguments that he made in the book. I'm presuming at least many of you have read the book, or at least perhaps by this will be eager to run out and read the book. But basically, that's what he was arguing against. That was his opponent. Okay, so how about how it got published and how, more importantly, it became kind of an iconic book. Just a quick, funny story. Yeah, it was written for people in Britain, but he decided he wanted to get an American publisher. He writes to a friend of his. His friend tries to float the manuscript to various publishers. They all say, forget about it. We don't want it. He finally sends it to one of his old college roommates, who is sitting next to a guy named Aaron Director. So who is Aaron Director? People have heard about Milton Friedman, right? And Milton Friedman's wife is Rose Friedman. Her name is actually Rose Director Friedman. So Aaron Director and Milton Friedman's wife are brother and sister. Okay? So Aaron is working alongside Mocklip in Washington, and he knows people at the University of Chicago. So he sends it up there. University of Chicago Press says, okay, we'll publish the book. So he gets an American publisher. Comes out in Britain. It's doing okay. That's in early 44. Comes out in the U.S., later 44. It's doing okay. Then the big thing happens. There's a guy who works at the University of Chicago Press, and he runs into someone else on the train. The person says, look, you want to send a copy of this to the Reader's Digest. Okay, there's a guy at the Reader's Digest who who would think that this is a pretty interesting manuscript, why don't you give it a try? Now, the person that he ended up sending it to, and let me just get my last, I don't want to forget about giving you this one, is Max Eastman. Okay, he's what was called a roving editor for the Reader's Digest. Now, I described that Reader's Digest, that thing that you find in your aunt's bathroom. Max Eastman was a former communist sympathizer, okay, leftist, a Trotskyite. But after Trotsky was rather badly treated, to say the least, under the Stalin regime, he turned against Stalinism and ultimately against communism as practiced in the Soviet Union, and ultimately against communism. Okay, so he was somebody who is kind of like someone who quits smoking and becomes a violent anti-smoker. This is the sort of guy that Eastman was, and Eastman, well, this was his response. He said, we must condense this book. Okay, this is an absolutely essential book. It says, The Road to Serfdom is, in my opinion, the most important political book of this era. If our civilization survives the desperate crisis it's passing through, it's because we arrive soon enough at the mature and expert wisdoms contained in this book. It is the science of our salvation and ought to be taught and studied, not just read and discussed. So, I mean, this is a guy who's having a really visceral reaction. I read that just to give you some sense of at least the way some people were right at the end of World War II. The end of World War II, okay, we finally defeated Hitler. Stalin's our ally, but what's the world going to look like once Germany has lost? You've got the Soviet Union coming in this way. You've got France, Germany, the United States coming this way. What is the world going to look like? What kind of economic organizations are we going to have? What kind of political organizations are we going to have? Where should we go with this? And it was in this particular environment that this book is produced. So they end up doing a Reader's Digest condensation of the book. At this time, it's right at the end of World War II. There's 8 million subscriptions to Reader's Digest, so it's going out all over the place. It made such a splash that another organization called the Book of the Month Club, which would put out things for its members, did 1 million reprints and sent these out. Ministers were giving out these reprints in church. Organizations, National Association of Manufacturers was distributing it to its membership. People were saying, look, we don't want to turn into a bunch of communists. This is the medicine to keep us from doing it. This tells you what is dangerous about socialism, why we need to embrace a free market society. Hayek, just one wonderful bit. So Hayek doesn't know about the Reader's Digest condensation. Well, he knows it's going to be coming out. He doesn't know its effect. He books a ship that takes him across the Atlantic to go to America to do a little tour of 4 academic departments where he'd talk a little bit about his book. He would see many of his friends that he hadn't seen all during World War II. He arrives in New York. In the time that between the time he had left and the time he arrived, the Reader's Digest condensation comes out. He gets to New York, and his little tour has been taken over. University of Chicago Press, that published the book, found a PR agency to take over the planning of his little 4-campus tour, and they throw in about 20 other venues that he goes. The first one is in New York, 3,000 people, overflow crowds. It's on the radio. This is Friedrich Hayek. This is an academic guy who's written a book because he's afraid about the future of Western civilization in some ways. But really, it's a book. I mean, nothing more and nothing less. And suddenly he's got these mass crowds. It's like, so here's a picture of Hayek. This is while he's on his tour. I don't know how many of you can see it, but those in the front, this is always I always like to reward people for sitting up front too. I mean, he just looks pleased as punch right there. You know, he's got his little smile. Now, just to show you what how he needed a PR agent, he's got a mustache. You know, they've just been fighting, 5-6 years against Hitler. This is a guy with a thick German accent, And it's not quite a Hitler mustache, but it's a mustache. Come on, Friedrich, what are you doing? Okay, so this gives you an idea of this is a guy who doesn't really, doesn't really have a sense of the public audience. But anyway, he's suddenly being touted. 15 minutes of fame. Now, what is this? Well, that episode is why we know about the road to serfdom today. At the time that he wrote this book, there was lots and lots and lots of people writing books about where are we heading now, what's going to happen after the war, what's the right economic and social and legal setup. There were dozens of these books. The reason this one became so famous is, well, I think there are some interesting arguments in it, so I'd be prepared to defend it on that, but really the proximate cause is this Reader's Digest condensation made him an overnight sensation, particularly in the United States. It was a book that everyone, or at least the condensation that everyone was discussing, okay? It really kind of became a lightning rod for people who were either in favor of markets or opposed to them. So there's a class here that's read some of the reviews of the book. In some quarters, they just said, this is a great book, this is wonderful, best thing for freedom ever written. Others were saying, it's full of holes, these arguments are terrible. So it really created a real reaction. This thing that I'm quoting from, this is what I'll end with, excuse me, is a leftist magazine called, it's actually called PM Magazine. And the title of this article is How Big Business Raised the Battle Cry of Serfdom. So he's basically, the argument of the author is that big business was using the road to serfdom to accomplish goals of rolling back regulation of business. And that would be why they would, his argument is basically, this is just a nerdy professor. Yeah, he's not making that argument, but he's being used. Yeah, he doesn't probably even realize he's being used, but he's being used by big business. Now, this shows National Association for Manufacturers, so they're demonstrating that big business is distributing copies of the condensed version. This magazine was published in later, around the time of the Nuremberg trials. Nuremberg trials were the trials of the German leadership after World War II. Ended up having a number of them executed, others sent to jail for various amounts of time. Some of them waited until the trial was over and then committed suicide to rob the executioner. But they would have newspaper stories where they'd have those guys who were all part of the Nazi leadership in the dock, and they'd have pictures like this. Well, yes, they have the same sets of pictures, and these are all the people who helped get The Road to Serfdom published. I don't know for a fact that that's what they're trying to duplicate, but you got to figure, given that it was right at that time, and you just get the... So who are these people? Aaron Director helps get the book published. The guy who wrote the introduction for Life magazine, Wallace, the head of Reader's Digest, Sherman, the Book of the Month Club sold reprints. These are all the people who helped facilitate this guy who's being used by big business. Finally, let's say you had a really short attention span, which is clearly not true for the people who are still here. Very good attention span, indeed. And you didn't want to read the 20-page Reader's Digest condensation. In Look magazine, they had it in cartoons. Okay? So those of you who can see that, you could actually get a cartoon version suitable for bedtime reading for the kids. Okay? So you'd be able to convince your kids to take Friedrich seriously. Anyway, that's all I have to say about The Road to Serfdom. Just kind of give you an idea of how a book that ends up being, again, strangely famous. The concluding remark would be, this strange fame of this book in 2010, 2008, 2006, culminating in 2010, there was a similar period. There's something about Hayek's writings, somehow. I don't know if it's about his writing or just his place in history, that his books become kind of touchstones for popular debates about big issues, which is a wonderful legacy, actually, to have. I'll stop here and just, as I said, questions about Road to Serfdom, questions about anything about Hayek, questions about the time. Let's see, what is the time? I hope I kept to my promise. So it looks like we have a, yeah, we're good. Okay. Okay, and there are microphones. And because this is being taped, please, if you have a question, speak into the microphone, and then I will repeat your question just to ensure that, in fact, the tape gets it. Yes?
Thank you. Is this on? Yeah. Thanks very much for regaling us with this story. Can you add a little bit more on? Why did it take 32 years for Hayek to be recognized by receiving the Nobel after the publication of this book?
Okay. So the question is, why did it take so long for Hayek to get the Nobel Prize, having written this book? The first thing is the Nobel Prize in Economics didn't start till 1969. Okay, so that's one thing. Secondly, he got it in 74, but he didn't get it for the Road to Serfdom. The Nobel Prize is a scientific prize for contributions to economic science, and the two areas that they recognized him in the citation for the Nobel was some of his early work on monetary economics, and secondly, for his contributions to our understanding of how markets prices help coordinate dispersed knowledge. When people in a country have all different sorts of knowledge about their specific industries, a market system allows that transfer of that knowledge among people. And that's what he was recognized for. So the Road to Serfdom would not have been mentioned, wasn't mentioned as a reason for getting the Nobel Prize. Indeed, as Hayek says in the introduction to the book, this is a political book. So I'm doing something different from what I normally do as an economist. Yes.
When Hayek was in London, after Keynes published the general theory, it took him, a lot of people are expecting him to respond to Keynes, but it took him a lot of years to write this book, and that book was not even a direct response to the general theory. So how can you explain this time period?
Yes. So the question is, why didn't Hayek respond to Keynes's general theory? It's probably one of the questions that Hayek was asked the most, okay? Because being that he knew Keynes, he had actually reviewed Keynes's book, A Treatise on Money, which was published in 1930. So they had this intellectual exchange. Everyone expected him to, and he didn't. And over the course of time, Hayek offered something like 7 different reasons why he didn't. And I actually have a paper intriguingly titled, Why Didn't Hayek Review Keynes' General Theory? And I review the various answers that he gave. One was, some of them seemed more plausible to me than others, just to give you a flavor of some of them. One is that I had engaged in that debate in the early 30s. We didn't accomplish very much. I'm writing my own second book. This is Keynes's book. I'd rather, instead of debating, I'll offer my vision, and this will be his vision, and we'll let people choose. That wouldn't have been a very good strategy, because the book that Hayek produced in 1941, called A Pure Theory of Capital, didn't go anywhere. Very few people, people did read it, but academic people read it. It didn't have anything like the impact of Keynes's general theory. Another reason that he gave was he thought that Keynes would just change his mind. That Keynes was famous for saying, okay, I believe this, and then the next week, I believe this, and he just thought, why should I write a review? He's just going to change his mind again. That was kind of a throwaway line that he used. There is a great joke. One of Keynes's more famous flip-flops was to take a certain policy stance, and then after Britain went off the gold standard, he reversed the policy stance. He was calling for tariffs, and he said, no, let's not use the tariffs. And this led to a joke. Whenever 6 economists gather, there's always 7 different opinions, and 2 of them are held by Keynes. Okay, so he was making, he's kind of playing off that kind of popular image of Keynes. He also said that, well, that this whole macroeconomic framework was something that he understood was wrong, but he didn't quite know how to do it, how to attack it. And by the time he was ready to, it was the time had passed. Another argument that he gave was, well, in the early 30s they were debating about the theory of the business cycle, but by the late 30s they're on the same side. they both want to save capitalism. The people that they're opposing are socialists, are communists, are people that have much more extreme views. And indeed, they became quite close, relatively. I mean, not that close, but they became much closer in the end of the 30s. Keynes found Hayek rooms to stay at in King's College in Cambridge when the LSE evacuated London, and they became much closer. So, if you want more than that, see my paper. Right. Alan. And got the,
following up on the same line there, did Keynes ever write a review of The Road to Serfdom? I mean, my understanding is that he thought quite favorably of The Road to Serfdom, but do you know if he did a formal review?
So The Road to Serfdom came out in '44, and Keynes read it either on the way to or on the way back from Bretton Woods. Wrote Hayek a letter in which he said, I agree with many parts of it. Not only agree, but agree in a kind of profound sense, which is bizarre if you think about the caricature of Keynes and Hayek today. But it does show you the similarities in terms of both being liberals of a certain sort, as opposed to these other groups. That said, he said, well, but you need to tell us more exactly what sort. You don't come out and say I'm for laissez-faire. In The Road to Serfdom, Hayek criticizes laissez-faire. He says there should be certain forms of government regulation. He identifies them vaguely. And Keynes says, look, you say there should be some forms, but you don't spell it out. You need to be a lot more exact about that. And this was something that Alvin Hansen in his review and others in their reviews also said, look, okay, even if I buy your arguments about socialism, many people did, tell us the society that you really want. And I think that Hayek took that criticism seriously. Certainly one way to read the Constitution of Liberty is trying to at least articulate the principles. This is his next book in 1960, articulate the principles under which he thought a free society should exist. There's a question right here, in the front. Yeah, right here, yeah. Right in the very front.
So why do you suppose the criticisms by Ludwig von Mises of socialism never rose to the same prominence of Hayek's?
I think they have, but probably mostly among Austrians. So the question is, wait a second, Ludwig von Mises was the one who really made the first argument against socialism in German language socialist calculation debates in the early 1920s. So right after World War I, just as Hayek was afraid was going to happen after World War II, people who were socialists said, let's continue with the planning that we've got during the war into peacetime. And it was Mises who articulated the first arguments about calculation, about the difficulty of calculation in a state in which the state owns the means of production. Mises's argument in a nutshell is that if the government owns the means of production, what prices do you attach to the factors of production that are used to produce goods and services? If you don't have prices, how do you know relative scarcities of various goods, and how do you make the decision? You'll end up having production just the way it looked in the Soviet Union. Massive waste of materials, according to some plan that somebody had made, instead of letting market prices signal where you've got relative plenty and relative scarcity. This very profound argument by von Mises was something that the British socialists in the 30s didn't know anything about. So Hayek's first book was actually touting von Mises's argument. It was a book called Collectivist Economic Planning, published in Britain in 1935. It has an introduction by Hayek and a conclusion. And in the middle are, I think, 3 articles that were translated. One of them, von Mises's famous 1920 article, articulating his case to the British. So Mises was certainly known. And I think certainly among certain Austrian camps, he would be better known as a representative, as a critic of socialism, according to that economic dimension. Mises also had a big book where he talked about social dimensions too, called Socialism, published in 1922 in German, published later, or translated later in the 30s. So why is Hayek associated with it? Well, I mean, someone could say, go ahead and get human action, okay? Now, is Glenn Beck's not even going to be able to pick up Human Action in such a heavy book and do this on TV? But The Road to Serfdom, and it's got that human action. What the heck is that about? Road to Serfdom, that's pretty clear. So it had certain advantages, just in that way. And I think and his book appears in 1944-45. Human Action, the English version, appears in 49, much later. So, it was a book that got noticed at that moment in time. Great question. Yes, there was someone else? Someone in the back.
So, in The Road to Serfdom, Hayek is very critical of large, totalitarian nation states such as Nazi Germany. Currently, in the modern day, democratic socialism is kind of the new trend that has been going on. Do you feel that the words of Hayek, and if he were still alive today, he would have been just as critical of democratic socialism as he would have been with a place like Nazi Germany or Soviet Russia?
Okay, so the question is, how would Hayek feel about democratic socialism? And this is actually a fascinating and question to which I'd like to give a somewhat detailed answer, but I'm not going to try to go too far. Certainly one of the arguments of The Road to Serfdom is that there's a conflict between democracy and socialism. If you define socialism as public ownership of the means of production, where plans about production of goods is being taken from the center, okay? How do you... Any plan that is authorized by the authorities is going to... Certain people are going to win, other people are going to lose. And the people who are winning are going to think it's great, but the people who are losing are really going to complain. So if you try to democratically get a change, well, you tweak the plan. Well, then some other group's going to gain, some other group's going to lose. And you're going to end up with gridlock. And Hayek's argument, for better or worse, I'm not saying you have to accept it, but he said, look, in a situation like that, at some point people just get fed up and they say, we need somebody who's strong to take control of this situation. You can see similar sorts of arguments actually taking place, perhaps, not quite the same, but similar in Egypt right now. What is this democracy that we've got now? I mean, you can't get anything done. You got the judges that are left over from the Mubarak regime. You've got the popular elected, but they disagree. And we need somebody to take control. And he said that the people who end up wanting to take control are not the people who are trying to do good for everyone, but they're the people who like power. Okay, that was his argument. So how does that? So he's actually arguing. That's the first point, that socialism, as he's defining it, and democracy don't mix. Now, you use the word democratic socialism, and there are other things, other ways of thinking about socialism. There's market socialism. There's other sorts of there's even, forget about socialism, maybe the welfare state, where you just have lots of programs that are aimed at remediating certain ills in society that people identify. So I would view The Road to Serfdom as an argument against what Hayek called hot socialism, the sort of socialism that was being defended by Lasky, the kind that would be full state control of the means of production. If you go to the Constitution of Liberty, he has a chapter called From Socialism to the Welfare State. Here he says, look, I think I've made good arguments against hot socialism, but nobody defends that anymore. I mean, in the democratic West. What people defend is we need to take care of this problem with this government program. This group needs this help, this group needs this help. And he says, so people are no longer defending it. Instead, what you've got are these individual programs. And he says, what I fear is that we're going to end up in socialism after a period of time without ever saying we're socialists. We're just going to end up saying, well, this problem needs this remediation, but that causes this problem, and then this group feels that they're not getting their fair share. And he says, and it's much harder to argue against that, because how do you do it? You end up saying, I don't think that group should be helped. He says, that's a hard argument to make if you're already helping this group. He says, it's much more insidious because it's not systematic. And he says, I fear that the goals of the socialists will be obtained through this kind of back doorway, and it's much harder to fight. So he was actually fairly despairing about that. That was in 1960. You can only imagine that his optimism receded even further. And by the time you get to the law, legislation, and liberty in the 70s, he's writing very darkly about how democratic processes are being misused by special interests that are gaining things for themselves. Always argued for in the name of social justice, but typically programs that end up not helping the people that they say they're aimed to help.
We have time for perhaps one more question. Is there another?
You alluded to his interest in science being seen as a very beneficiary aspect of society. Was that the time his seeds for counter-revolution of science, his other work? Is that where that came from?
So, in fact, the book, The Abuse and Decline of Reason, that big book that he was going to write that ends up not being published, and instead he writes The Road to Serfdom, the first bits of that big book are things that he collected in the edition that you're talking about, The Counter-Revolution of Science. And that essay, The Scientism and the Study of Society, was going to be the opening chapter of this larger book. So he got some of the big book done. The Scientism talks about the limits of science and the over-optimism that he thought people had about science. And the rest of what's called the counter-revolution of science is about that French period, that initial French period. They called Polytechnique, Henri Saint-Simon, Auguste Comte, and how they said, we can engineer society just the way we at the École Polytechnique engineer bridges. He said that was the beginning of the idea. Interesting intellectual history. People debate about how to what extent we might believe it. But that was the argument he was going to make, but he ends up just publishing that separately. But exactly right. Came out under the name Counter-Revolution of Science, and that was where he started talking about the limits of science.
And what year was that?
So the essay, The Counter-Revolution of Science, actually appeared in Economica. Economica was publishing lots of his stuff. You know who the editor of Economica was? Friedrich Hayek. This guy, I tell you. Anyway, so it came out in 3 parts, 1941 to 44. And Scientism essay also was published in parts, all in Economica. So it was all published during the war years, and then finally gathered together as a book in 1952.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Please join me in thanking Professor Caldwell.
Thank you. Thank you very much.